I
did, yes.
What about undergrad? Where did you do that?
Also at Cambridge. I'm very boring. Wow. So I stayed in the same place.
No, that's really interesting to hear, because I'm thinking about, I quite like this researchy thing. I might stick at it. And I've been told, so I have a PhD mentor, and they're like, if you're going to go into research, if you want to do a PhD, don't do your MA in Leeds, go somewhere else, your MS again for your PhD. And I was like, that's a lot of adjusting to new places for me.
Yeah.
And especially for the MA, which is like only a year.
I know,
So, I mean,
Why did they say that? Do you know why that was their advice?
Networking. Using people, which I can get, but like for a year's MA, I was like, well, me being me, I'm not like, I've only just started to put myself out there, to be honest, and like I started to be like, hi, I feel semi-comfortable in like, this situation. Me being me, I'm very introverted until I'm comfortable in a situation, and then like, who knows what could happen. But and I think James could testify to that. But
yep.
Hello and welcome. If you are looking for the What is Christianity All About and Are We Better Off Without It event, congratulations! You have found us, and it is so great to have you here. If you weren't looking for this event and you have just happened to stumble across it and you've ended up here, you are so welcome, and it's so great to have you with us. So do stick around. We've got some really great things planned for the next hour. And why don't you comment below in the comments box down below, or the live chat, because this is being live streamed actually. Just comment below where you're watching from, who you're watching with. It'd be great to get to know some of you guys. But yes, I am Charlotte. I am a third year communication and media student studying at the University of Leeds, and I'm also a member of the Christian Union at the university as well. So tonight's focus will be on the big questions we face. This series is about life, meaning, faith, and humanity, and just about everything in between. We as a Christian Union exist to have those big questions which really matter. And universities should be a space where you have the freedom to honestly ask those questions and engage with the answers. So through these big question events, we want to give you space to consider and discuss what Christians actually believe and see what hope this can offer in the 21st century life. If at any point during the evening you have any questions, do follow the link in the description box that's down below this video, and you can go to slido.com where you'll be able to enter the event code, which is 70154. So 70154 to anonymously ask any questions that come up for you during the evening. So to give you just a really quick rundown of what's going to happen tonight, and we're going to be hearing from Rebecca McLaughlin, and Rebecca is going to be answering the question, what is Christianity all about, and are we better off without it? Then we'll be hearing from James Warman, and James is a Leeds University student. He is doing a PhD, and we're just going to be having a bit of a candid chat about what it means to be a Christian and what led up to his decision to become a Christian after having spent the earlier part of his life an atheist. And then finally, just to round things off and conclude it, those questions you've been submitting all evening, we will be answering them. So do make sure you're heading over to slido.com using either typing that into your browser or following the link in the description box below. And use the event code 70154. So just having a look in the comments. Hi Charlie, hi Zach, Lizzie. We've got some people from Kirkstall, Burley Park and Woodhouse. Zach Powell suggesting a turf war. Let's not have a turf war. We love all of those places. Hi Rachel, it's so great to have you guys with us. So yes, if you're just tuning in, welcome. This is the What is Christianity all about, and are we better off without it event, where we're going to be answering that question and hearing from Rebecca McLaughlin. So without further ado, it is my absolute honour and privilege to introduce to you doctor, author and worldwide public speaker Rebecca McLaughlin. Rebecca holds a PhD in medieval literature from Cambridge University and a theology degree from Oak Hill Seminary in London. She is a regular writer for the Gospel Coalition and author of the best-selling book Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. She is also the co-founder of a data-driven communications firm and lives with her husband and 3 kids. If you're a fan of the Myers-Briggs personality types, then you may be intrigued to know that Rebecca is an ENFP. But without further ado, Rebecca, hey, it's so lovely to have you. How are you doing?
It is a great pleasure to be not here, but sort of here, in the weird way that we are all here.
Great. So Rebecca, why don't you just tell us, before you get started, a little bit more about yourself. So who are you and where you're from, and what are you doing with your work and life right now?
I grew up mostly in London, and that's still a place that I consider in my heart of hearts to be my home. But for the last 13 years, I've lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or New Cambridge, as I like to call it, because it's in New England, so it really should be New Cambridge. Between London and New Cambridge, I spent 7 years in Old Cambridge, proper Cambridge, whatever you want to call it, as you mentioned in the bio. And you know how people often say that if you're going to meet a future spouse, you probably meet them in college. I had to spend 7 years in college before I met the guy I ended up marrying, which, may tell you something about me. One of the things it tells you is that it's actually really quite hard to find a serious Christian man in the UK, at least when I was there at the time. So I married a guy from Oklahoma, and he dragged me kicking and screaming across the pond of America. But it's actually been great here. In America, people like English people, whereas in England, people don't really like Americans. So that was his main argument as to why we should move here. And we have 3 kids who are 10, 8, and 2.5.
Wow, that's so nice. So before we do get started, before we do hear from you, earlier I asked you a question, and so I'm going to share that question with everyone else. So I gave Rebecca a little bit of a heads up on this question because it's a bit of a tough question, and if you tuned in last time, you'll know I quite enjoy these tough get to know people questions. So today's question of the day is, what was the last time you did something for the first time?
This question has made me feel so boring. And I'm sure there is a paragliding experience that I've just completely forgotten about that happened really recently, or something very glamorous, but I can't think what it is. So instead, I'm going to tell you that earlier this year, I shared some of my best friends' coffee. This was pre-pandemic, where, you know, one shared things freely. And I quite enjoyed drinking it. And I hate coffee. So it was like the first time I was drinking coffee and actually enjoying it versus not, which indeed proves I'm the most boring person you know or don't know at this point.
No, that so great. And as a fellow non-coffee drinker, if we could say that, I'm definitely a tea lover. I have too many cups of tea a day, but yes, I can totally relate to that. And maybe some of the people watching this live stream can, or maybe they are absolutely outraged at the fact that you and I both are not massive coffee fans. But anyway, I divulge. But yes, so as Rebecca talks, if at any point you have any questions, just remember you can use that code 70154 or follow the link in the description box below to anonymously submit any questions you have to Slido. But without further ado, Rebecca, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. And it really is a pleasure to sort of be here because I really miss England. So I love it when I get to speak to Brits in whatever form, even this strange one. I'm a really good friend who's still a close friend of mine when I was at grad school in the UK. They didn't call it grad school in the UK, did they? It's I've become Americanized in too many ways. When I was doing my MPhil and the first part of my PhD, a really good friend who's an American secular Jewish atheist, brilliant scientist, and he is now a professor of the natural sciences at Harvard. And in 2013, I took my friend and his then girlfriend to an event at Harvard where the famous New Testament scholar N.T. Wright was in dialogue with the agnostic chair of the Harvard philosophy department. And the title of the event was The Bible, Gospel Guide or Garbage. So after this event, I said to my very clever friend, I said, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. And his then girlfriend, who is a much gentler soul than either of us, said, oh, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around a first century man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend agreed. But I think one of the interesting things about the last sort of 10 or 20 years since I've first started having conversations with folks who were not Christians and thought what I believe was crazy, was that whereas 10 or 20 years ago, a lot of my friends would think that Christians were just sort of stupid for believing the strange things that we believe about this first century Jewish man, I think today actually more often people think that it's not just stupid, it's also immoral. In fact, I don't know if you guys remember the late, great Christopher Hitchens, who was one of these sort of classic new atheists. He wrote a book called God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And that became a bestseller. So the main question that I'd like us to think about today in our short time is whether he was right. And because that idea of religion actually comprises everything from sort of Amish farmer to the ISIS fighter, I'm going to focus that in on this question of Christianity and ask, does Christianity poison everything? Is Christianity good for us? Is Christianity even worth considering? And there are 4 points that I would like to make in our time, all of which are potentially controversial and offensive. So I look forward to the Q&A time. The first is that Christianity is good for you. The second is that Christianity is good for us. The third is that Christianity defines goodness. And the fourth is that Christianity might just be true. And again, I look forward to the Q&A time. And I would love especially to hear from folks who, like my friend who I took to that event, think that what I believe is crazy. So I look forward to your questions. So number one, what's this claim? Christianity is good for you. And new atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins have hung their hats on scientific evidence and data. And it turns out that if we look at what the evidence and data shows us, and I'm looking here to a lot of research that's come out of the Harvard School of Public Health, not far from where I live here, it turns out that this idea that religion poisons everything is just simply empirically untrue. In fact, there's a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health named Tyler Vanderveel, who in 2016 wrote an op-ed for USA Today, one of the big newspapers over here, under the title, "Religion May Be a Miracle Drug." And it began like this: if one could conceive of a single elixir to improve the physical and mental health of millions of Americans at no personal cost, what value would society place on that? And Professor Vandervelde went on to enumerate the multiple mental and physical health benefits that come from or associated with, correlated with regular religious participation. So, for example, going to church once a week or more seems to have a highly protective effect in terms of a lot of both mental and physical health conditions, funnily enough. So we've all heard that you should eat more fruits and vegetables to become healthier. Turns out that going to church once a week or more is an equivalent health intervention to eating more fruits and veg. So if you really hate Brussels sprouts, just start going to church, it'll sort of even out. We all know that smoking's bad for us. But it turns out that going to church once a week or more is only slightly less good for you than stopping smoking. So again, if you want to keep with the fags, then at least start going to church. Everything will almost balance out. It turns out even, and this is it's sort of almost sad to have to mention, but a large scale study done by Harvard School of Public Health showed that women who go to church once a week or more are 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never attend. And in some very recent research that was published earlier this year, they were looking at deaths from despair. So that's deaths caused by drugs, alcohol, or suicide. And they found that for women in America, there's a sort of almost 70% protective effect of regular church attendance. For men, it's more like 33%. So simply, purely in terms of sort of mental and physical health, whether or not Christianity is true, going to church once a week or more is actually good for you. So that's my first point. My second point is Christianity is good for us. What do I mean by that? Well, the regular religious participation sort of positive effects aren't just limited to our mental and physical health. They actually have a major effect on our pro-social behavior. Now, all of us know Christians who are unpleasant, selfish people. In fact, often as I look at myself, that's a description that I recognize. And one of the most important things to know about Christianity is that Christians aren't saying we're better than you. We're actually saying we're so bad that we needed Jesus to come and die for us. But it's also the case that if we just look at kind of the data sets, we see that people who attend church once a week or more give 3.5 times as much money to charity as their secular peers. And that's both to actually, not just to religious charities, also to secular charities. They volunteer twice as much. They're half as likely to engage in domestic violence, and they're less likely to commit at least 43 other crimes. It may well be more than that, but that's the number that have been specifically analysed. Even Richard Dawkins, in his latest book, Outgrowing God, which is aimed at teenagers considering faith questions, he had to begrudgingly acknowledge that actually believing in God does seem to have a positive effect on how we humans treat each other. But even that claim that Christianity is good for us in some moral sense raises a more fundamental question, which is what does good actually even mean? And that brings us to our third point, which is that Christianity defines goodness. Now, for many of us, it seems like there are self-evident moral truths that whether you're a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist or an atheist or Jewish background or Muslim, whatever you are, we can all agree on some basic moral things. For example, that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal. Human rights are an important thing and that something that should be upheld. That men and women are equally morally equal, and that the poor and the weak and the marginalized should be able to make moral demands on the rich and the strong and the powerful. Now that feels to us today like just basic moral common sense. But actually, it is specifically Christian morality. Now don't take my word for that. There are a couple of non-Christian scholars who I would point you to on this question, both of whose books I've read recently. So one is this massive, fat book by a British historian, Tom Holland, who's not a Christian, called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And Holland's looking at the last 2,000 years of Christian history and thinking. And he is someone who gave up on the idea of believing in the Christian God as a teenager because he was much more attracted to the Greek and Roman gods. He now recognizes and argues in this book that the reason we believe in the basic things like universal human rights and care for the poor and oppressed and marginalized and the equality of men and women, that's because of Christianity. We just don't realize it. Another guy you may have come across is Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote this global bestseller, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. in it, one of the things he's very blunt about is the fact that human rights are a Christian fiction. He says, Homo sapiens, we have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. So this idea that there is universal moral beliefs that are kind of independent of any particular religious perspective is actually not true. Now this realization dawned gradually for one of the few people who knew both me and my husband before we knew each other. So my friend Sarah is now a professional historian. She's a history professor in Australia. And when I met Sarah, we were both doing PhDs at Cambridge, and she was good friends with my now husband. And she was sort of polite atheist. She'd grown up in a loving secular home in Sydney, Australia. And she believed passionately in things like human rights, but she didn't think that Christianity had anything to do with that. In fact, she thought that Christianity was the enemy of those things. But after finishing her PhD at Cambridge, she went to Oxford, always a mistake, but anyway, she did. And there she went to a series of lectures by a very famous Australian atheist philosopher called Peter Singer. And Sarah was very excited to hear from Peter Singer, but as she listened to his lectures, she experienced what she later described as a sort of intellectual vertigo, as she realized that the deepest things that she believed morally were actually not founded on her atheism at all. Singer was arguing that rather than human beings being seen as equally morally valuable just because we're human, that we should actually evaluate beings, human or otherwise, according to our capacities. So, for example, our capacity to suffer, our capacity to self-awareness, etc. And by his calculation, a human infant is less morally valuable than an adult cow. Now, this really shook Sarah and made her question her atheism. And the more that she looked into it, the more she researched, the more she found that actually, whereas she'd thought that Christianity was the enemy of everything that she most deeply believed, it actually turned out to be the foundation for those things. And so she ended up becoming a Christian. She was 28 and a professor of history at the University in America. So that's our third point. Christianity defines goodness. And then finally, Christianity might just be true. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know about the folks you grew up with or around or your friend group at the moment. But for many of us, especially in the West and especially in the university setting, it can feel like Christianity is kind of this like slightly crazy belief system that's really on its way out. Like we don't even actually honestly have to worry about whether it's true or not, because our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren are going to consider belief in God to be just unsustainable. There was a hypothesis sort of well accepted by psychologists, sociologists of religion 40 years ago, which was that as the world became more modern and more educated and more scientific, the religious belief would naturally decline. And it turns out that just hasn't happened globally. In fact, the opposite has happened. And as we look at over the next 40 years, we're anticipating an increasingly religious world, with Christianity continuing to be the largest global belief system, actually increasing its global share. And atheism, agnosticism, no religious belief, like all those folks who would identify as non-religious globally, that demographic is set to decline from about 60% to about 30% by 2060. So this idea that we don't actually have to take Christianity seriously doesn't align with the facts. So then how can we take this strange belief system seriously? What even are the basics of Christian belief? Well, Christians believe first that there is a God who made the universe, and he made every single one of us. And let me be clear, that is not a sort of alternative hypothesis to modern science. Actually, the folks who first devised what we now call modern science did so because they believed in the God of the Bible, who is both rational and free. So they weren't seeing belief in science as an alternative to a belief in a creator. They actually developed what we now see as science because they believed in a creator God. But that's one of the first starting points of Christianity, is there is a creator God who made you and who made me. Second point is that all of us are turned away from that God. And that this is something that the Bible calls sin. And it's broken that relationship between us and God. It's also broken our relationships with other people. And we can see that every time we open a newspaper or scroll a news feed. We can see really terrible things being done by human beings. And Christianity has a name for that. That's called sin. But one of the unsettling things about the Christian faith is that as I open up the newspaper or as I scroll through my newsfeed and I read about those terrible things that people out there are doing, I actually can't put any real moral distance between me and them. Jesus, for example, said, you've heard that it said, don't commit murder, but I said that anyone who's angry with his brother has already committed murder in his heart. He said, you've heard that it said, don't commit adultery, but I say to you, anyone who's looked at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. So from Jesus' perspective, I'm actually not fundamentally morally different from the person who's committed murder or from the child sex offender. We're actually all cut from that same moral cloth. Now, that's a really terrible situation to be in, because according to Christianity, there is a holy God who loves us, but he will also hold us accountable for our sin. And we have a choice. We either stand before God on our own merits and pay for our own sin, or we hide ourselves in Jesus Christ. Because you see, God loved us so much, the Bible tells us, that he sent his only son, Jesus, to die in our place. And in fact, Jesus took on himself all the sin of the world. He took on himself the right judgment that was due for that sin. And he paid that penalty. He washed the slate clean. So anyone now who puts their trust in Jesus, be they a murderer, be they a paedophile, be they a terrorist, be they somebody like a normally sinful human being like me, anyone who puts their trust in Jesus can be brought back into that relationship with God. And we see that not just in Jesus' death on the Roman cross, but we actually also see that proved by his resurrection to new life. And I often say this to my kids. I've got, as I said, 3 kids who are 10, 8, and 2.5. And every time we drive past a cemetery, and they'll say things like, "Oh, Mummy, is that where all the dead people are?" I said, "Yeah, but don't be too hard on the dead people. You'll be one of them one day." But I said, if you're trusting in Jesus, then one day Jesus is going to call you out of that grave, and he's going to call you into relationship with him. And he's going to call you into a new world, of which the absolute best human relationships we could ever have in this world give us the tiniest little glimpse or echo. And all of us have the opportunity to be part of that. So when I had that conversation with my friend after that event at Harvard, as I said, he still believes that what I believe is crazy. But actually, many of the things that he believes are ultimately crazy too, because he really does care about other human beings. He really does care about the poor in other parts of the world who, without Christianity, would have no real moral claim on him. And ultimately, my hope is that everyone has the opportunity to hear about this possibility of faith in Jesus would recognize quite what a good deal it is for us, and would be willing to put their faith in the one who came and did truly crazy things for us. I would love to hear questions in a minute, but I think Charlotte's going to interview James first. Is that right?
Yes, that is. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was really thought-provoking. And yeah, like Rebecca said, if you have any follow-up questions, do submit them via Slido. The code is 70154. And I've been having a little flick through already. Got some good ones coming in. But here's the but. We're going to be chatting to James. So you've got a short while to submit more questions, to submit anything that's on your mind which you want answering. And also, if you've got no questions, which is completely understandable, still head over, use the link in the description box below, or just go to slido.com in your browser and type in 70154. And then you can, there's a little thumbs up button towards the side. You press that for the questions you like, and it will upvote them, which means we're more likely to answer them. So that's a great thing to do. If you just don't have any questions, still head on over. It'll be great. But yeah, so while you're busy typing and voting for some questions, we're going to be chatting to James Warman. Now, James is a PhD student researcher at the University of Leeds studying chemistry. So James, hello.
Hello.
Can you just tell me a little bit more about who you are and what you're up to in Leeds?
Yeah, what can I add other than what you've already said? I'm James. I'm 23 now. I'm in my 6th year at Leeds. Actually, I did my undergrad here in chemistry at the University of Leeds, and now I'm now doing my PhD, focusing more specifically on atmospheric chemistry. So I study air pollution and how we can sort of monitor that and hopefully, provide solutions. And then in my spare time, I do all kinds of things, really. I mean, I bake, I draw, play piano. Yeah, whatever takes my fancy, I suppose.
That sounds so fun. But so James, I know you are a Christian, but I know you haven't always been. So I was wondering, would you be able to share with me and those watching this live stream just a little bit more about what changed for you?
Yeah. As you quite rightly pointed out, I wasn't always a Christian. I did actually grow up with a Christian background. I was, taken to church with my brother when we were kids, and something about that never really quite felt genuine, and never really quite felt like the people going to that church really believed it. And if that's you and you've had that experience where you've gone to a church and it doesn't feel genuine, then let me tell you just a little bit of what I discovered when I came to Leeds. So the first thing I suppose one of the first things that I discovered when I came to Leeds, I actually ended up in a flat with a Christian. And this Christian, very, very lovely girl. She was very welcoming, very friendly, and there were a whole group of them that used to hang out and meet up in halls, and they were just a very warm and welcoming group, as I've said, and I just ended up joining along with them, kind of hanging out with them, and eventually I ended up going to a church in Leeds. They after much nagging and posturing, they persuaded me to go along to their church, and so I did, and it was unlike anything I've ever really experienced in church before. It was very genuine. I could tell people had a lot of charisma. They were very passionate. They really believed like what they were there for, and so I had a whole journey of exploring faith and what that meant, whether I wanted it, whether it was for me. And eventually I reached the conclusion that it was, after a good few months of searching. And I met Jesus. I came into relationship with Jesus Christ, and I've never looked back.
Wow, that is such an amazing story. So having lived life both as an atheist, which is not having a faith, not believing in God or Jesus, and now living life as a Christian, how has this, what difference has this had in your life? And why is it now such a big part of your life?
It's a really great question. I think the key differences or the key things you have to kind of pay attention to is actually what it is that you want out of life, where it is you're searching for that, and ultimately where you find it. And so I think for me personally, I'm sure there's quite a few people that can relate to this. What I was really searching for was intimacy and relationship. That's not just romantic relationships. That's friendships. That's wanting to connect with people. I wanted to be loved. I wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere. And I think one of the hardest things about actually trying to find those things in other people, in my case, or in things that aren't Jesus or the Bible, is that ultimately I found that they never really satisfied. They never really fulfilled me. They weren't enough. Like, for example, I'd come to uni, I wanted to be popular or make a lot of friends, and like often I would just find myself, trying maybe a bit too hard, or maybe feeling like I'm not trying enough. And that can be debilitating, that fear of, what are people going to think of me if I do this, or what's going to happen if I kind of display this opinion. But then I met Jesus. I say I met Jesus. What I mean by that is, I had an experience where I felt his presence. I felt him alongside me. It's a very, very difficult experience to describe. But all of a sudden, my life changed completely. All of a sudden, I was more comfortable in myself. I knew that I belonged with him. I knew that I was accepted by him, that I was loved by him. Like, I didn't have to keep searching for these things. I had an intimate relationship with him. And one of the most beautiful things about that is that Jesus was and is perfect. Like, he never puts a foot wrong. And I think we would probably all agree in saying that none of us can fit that category of being perfect. We all have our flaws. We all have our shortcomings. Often we'll find ourselves in sticky situations or do things that we say things that we might regret. And yeah, that moment or that journey that I've been on since has been a journey of setting me free from my fears, and stopping me from searching for the things that I want in places that are never going to satisfy me.
Yeah. That's actually really amazing to hear. Just how Jesus is at work and that he can be working in your life too. So very quickly, just as we finish and head over to the Q&A, got two more questions. How does this, all your experiences of how you call it meeting Jesus or experiencing his presence alongside you, how does that affect how you understand God to be? And how could someone who hasn't had the same experiences as you encounter God for the first time?
Yeah, that's really great. I've talked about, having a relationship with Jesus, and I think that's one of the biggest parts of how I actually understand God. It's a part of Christian theology in saying that Jesus and God are one and the same. You may have heard of the Holy Trinity, God being three in one. You have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, we believe that Jesus was fully man, but also fully God. And so in my relationship with Jesus, that helps me to understand God. But I think you need both that relationship, that personal relationship, and the Bible, which tells us who God is in there. There's 4 really great books in there that give an account of Jesus' life. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, also known as the 4 Gospels. And those words in there, they just serve to reinforce what I've already experienced in my relationship with Jesus. They tell of how loving and caring Jesus is, how he looks out for the marginalized in society. And they also say as well how he kind of helps to shape and mold his disciples, his followers. And I've experienced that myself as well, becoming a better person through Jesus. As for the second question, how can someone else experience that? Well, I'd really just encourage you to say a prayer, to talk to God, either out loud or in your heart, and just invite Jesus to come into your life. And you might be thinking, well, how do I do that? I don't really know how to pray. Well, there's a verse in the book of Matthew which I mentioned just earlier, which says, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you." And simply all you need to do is reach out with your heart and say, Jesus, I want you to come into my life. I want to recognize you as the Lord and Savior of my life. I want to recognize that I'm not perfect and I need someone to help save me from that.
Thank you, James.
I was just going to finish with a promise that meeting Jesus is like nothing you've ever experienced before, and a choice that you'll never regret as well.
That is a really good way to finish. We are now going to jump over to Rebecca. Rebecca is still here with us, and we're going to go through some of these questions, as many as we can squeeze into this hour. So, Rebecca, are you ready?
I hope so.
Right. Okay. We're going to start at the top. We're going to go for the most voted questions. But feel free to just keep adding them, keep upvoting them. My phone hopefully should be like swapping all around the orders as they get upvoted as you add new ones, so I will be keeping an eye on that. So Rebecca, the first question is, surely Christianity is also responsible for lots of evil and oppression in the world? What would you say to that?
Yeah, first up I say yes. The Bible is very real, as I said, about the human capacity for sin, and in particular, or not least, the capacity of Christians to sin. In fact, John, one of Jesus's followers, said that if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So to the extent that the church throughout the world is full of people like me, you will see the church doing things that are evil. One question, though, is how do we know they're evil? And actually, a lot of the things that we look at in the world and say, you know what, that's evil, and I can't believe that Christians could have participated in something like that. We only know that's evil because the Bible has told us so. For example, I mean, slavery was completely pervasive and normal in the ancient world. Nobody thought anything of it. I mean, it was just a fact of life that there were slaves and there were masters, and that was how it was. There was no kind of moral problem with that. Likewise, people thought there was no problem with if you had a baby, especially if they were a baby girl or if they had a disability, just leaving them out to die. Nothing morally problematic about that. Child abuse was actually, like, you know, sexually abusing children, slaves, women, anyone who was kind of vulnerable around you, perfectly reasonable behavior in the Greco-Roman Empire. Conquering another nation and slaughtering, you know, thousands, you know, showing that you've won by killing as many people as you could, just like watching your favorite sports team win. The reason we think these things are wrong and evil are because of the first century Jewish man called Jesus Christ. And I've actually just written an endorsement for a new book that's coming out that's looking at, the title is, I think, something like Saints and Bullies, a clear look at the last 2,000 years. I forget the exact subtitle, but it's kind of looking at actually, you know, how have Christians acted through the last 2,000 years? And especially looking at things like the Crusades, which are often, you know, rightly seen as low points of Christian history. And it's absolutely true that there are times when Christians have behaved in ways that are clearly against the teachings of Jesus Christ. It's also true that Christians were the first to invent hospitals, to invent welfare systems for the poor, to believe that actually you should love people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different countries, different nations, rather than seeing them as hostile enemies. And that there are many ways in which through the ages, Christians truly have lived up to these ideals. So that's another part of the answer. And the final piece I look at is what are we comparing Christianity to? So for a while, people thought, you know, really, religion is the problem. I mean, if it weren't for all these terrible religions causing people to do awful things, human beings who are fundamentally good would start behaving like that, right? Communism has been a massive experiment in that, of taking things which in some ways are like basically wonderful ideas, like this idea that human beings are fundamentally equal and there should be a sort of brotherhood across all sorts of different people. But throwing out all the God stuff from that idea, which is where it first came from. And if you look at communism in the last, you know, century, you see orders of magnitude more death and oppression than any religious sort of tradition could boast. So I think, whereas it is absolutely true and a right and a valid critique of Christianity that Christians have often not lived up to the commands of our Saviour, we also need to recognise we're not comparing Christianity to another sort of perfectly coherent secular worldview that gives us the foundation for our deepest moral beliefs and a motivation to follow them. We're not actually making a fair comparison there.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can you say that there is hope in the Christian faith? I've had multiple attempts and hospitalizations over the last 10 years, and nothing can ever change that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear quite all of that question, so I want to be careful.
So they're just asking, how is there hope in the Christian faith dealing with, I guess, quite serious mental health problems, because they've mentioned having multiple suicide attempts and hospitalizations.
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, and thank you so much, the person asking that question. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, and I'm deeply sorry to hear that's been your experience. And I want to be clear as well, I was packing a lot into a short period of time earlier, so didn't give context to a lot of things. And one thing I want to say is that whereas it is true that active religious participation seems to have a significant protective effect on depression and suicidal ideation. In fact, according to Tyler Vanderbilt, it's about the most protective thing that we're aware of in terms of a sort of intervention against suicidal ideation. It's also the truth that Christians throughout the ages have struggled with severe and debilitating depression. And in fact, that's been true of some of the greatest kind of heroes of Christianity, some extraordinary preachers and servants of the Lord who are well known to Christians who have struggled with bouts of very severe depression. So I wouldn't for a second want to communicate that become a Christian and all of those challenges will evaporate. That's simply not true. To ask where is hope in Christianity, and again, I can't pretend to understand your personal experiences here, so forgive me for how inadequate my answer is going to be. But at the times in my life when I have found myself, lying on the floor crying, which, if we're honest, probably all of us have had those moments, even if it's not something that plagues us on an ongoing basis. I tend to remind myself of a particular story in the Bible, which comes in John's Gospel in chapter 11, when Jesus is called on by two of his best friends, two women called Mary and Martha. His brother is dying. And they say, Lord, the one you love is sick. And Jesus, it says, because he loved Mary and Martha and their brother, he stayed where he was for a couple more days. And you think, well, wait a minute, that can't be right. If Jesus loved them, surely he would have come right away and met their need. They're calling out for him. But he deliberately waits until Lazarus is dead. And then he comes and he meets with these grieving sisters, with Martha in particular. And she says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, he will do for you. And Jesus replies to her, your brother will rise again. And she's like, yeah, great theological answer. I know he's going to rise again one day, the resurrection and the end times. But, what good is that to her now? You can almost hear in her voice a sort of disappointment, like, why wouldn't you help me now, Jesus? What about now? And Jesus looks into her eyes and he says some of the most powerful words ever uttered by a human being. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus' outrageous claim to this grieving, desperate woman was that what she most needed wasn't her brother back. What she most needed wasn't Jesus to fix her problem. What she most needed was Jesus himself, that he is the resurrection and the life. And the thing about resurrection is you have to die first. Now, I don't at all mean that in the sort of literal sense. I don't think, the Lord is calling us to any form of, self-harm. But as a Christian, my hope is found in the fact that in any situation when I feel like I'm dying and drowning, Jesus is my resurrection in my life. And that story goes on with two more moves. One is that, Mary, the other sister, comes out and falls at Jesus' feet weeping, says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Same question as her sister. He goes with them to the tomb and he weeps with the two sisters by their brother's tomb. And some of the people there say, see how much he loved him, he's crying. And other people say, well, wait a minute, couldn't he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have stopped this man from dying? But Jesus, even though he let Lazarus die, and even though he knows what he's going to do next, he takes the time to weep with these sisters. And so when we are in that place of complete and utter despair, if we're trusting in Jesus, we can know for sure that he holds us and that he weeps with us. And it's not that our suffering doesn't matter. It matters enough to bring tears to the eyes of the Son of God. And then in the last movement in that story, Jesus tells them to roll the stone away from Lazarus's tomb, and he says, Lazarus, come out. And then the Bible says the man who was dead came out. So if you're trusting in Jesus, you're trusting in the only man who can one day call you out of the grave. And without that hope, none of us really have ultimate hope. Sorry if that was a long answer.
No, it's okay.
What's the question?
The next question is, if I have a good life, respecting and loving others, but I'm not a Christian, why do I have to go to the same place as a murderer or a rapist?
Yeah, such an important question. I don't know. Have any of you guys seen the show The Good Place?
No, but it is definitely on my watch list.
Yeah. So for those who haven't, it's a comedy set in the afterlife, which is, it took me a while to sort of warm up to that idea. As it was a question. But at the beginning of the show, this woman called Eleanor wakes up one day, and this kind man says to her, Eleanor, you died, but don't worry, it's okay. You're in the good place. Everything's fine. And you find that she has, this guy explains to her that she's come to the good place because she lived an outstandingly good life. And so she's going to be here with all the other incredibly good people. And Eleanor's thinking, okay, this is really worrying because she knows she's not a good person. She's like, I'm not a really bad person. I don't think I deserve the bad place with all the murderers, but I don't deserve a good place. I deserve a medium place. And I think that's how a lot of us think when it comes to, this idea of heaven and hell, these two sort of places to which God might send us. Actually, that's not at all how the Bible would have us think about this idea of heaven or hell. Because from the Bible's perspective, it's fundamentally about our relationship with Jesus. Now, I understand how it can sound completely arbitrary, well, what you mean I'm sent to heaven or hell on the basis of whether I happen to mentally ascend to this guy 2,000 years ago. And that sounds crazy. But if Jesus is who the Bible says he is, if he is the resurrection and the life, as he claimed in that story I just told, then being without Jesus means being eternally dead. If he is the bread of life, as the Bible calls him, as he calls himself, and then being without Jesus means being desperately hungry. If he is the way, the truth, and the life, then being without Jesus means being completely and eternally lost. If he is the light of the world, then being without Jesus means living in utter darkness. So from the Christian perspective, actually, none of us deserve the good place. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God, as the Bible puts it. And yet, any of us, if we put our trust in Jesus, can be welcomed into his arms, which is what heaven means. Heaven is not this sort of place divorced from a person. Heaven is the full relationship with Jesus that those of us who are trusting him now are kind of getting the first taste of. And hell is the opposite. So there is an internal logic to these two ideas that I think often, if we haven't actually been able to open the Bible and sort of understand it from a Christian perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but hopefully it does a little bit more now.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. I've just seen the time, so we're going to very, very, very quickly squeeze in one more question, and I'm going to start to wrap up. So the next most outvoted question is, why am I sinful and what have I done wrong? I consider myself to be a law-abiding citizen, and I wouldn't put myself in the same place as a murderer.
Yeah. Again, I'm going to slightly popular culture reference here. My husband and I recently watched the series Broadchurch, and at the risk of massive spoilers, the two first seasons of Broadchurch hinge around two different murder scenarios. And in both cases, it turns out that the person who is guilty of the murder either didn't mean to do it or kind of felt forced into it by circumstances. Now, it is never, in my life up to this point, I have never been in a situation where murdering somebody would be advantageous to me. actually, it would be a complete disaster. If I went and shot someone in the street now, it would only make my life worse. So I can certainly say, well, I'm not like those murderers over there. But the more I understand about history, the less sure I am about that conclusion. And if you look at, for example, Nazi Germany, a lot of people in Nazi Germany who thought that they were perfectly good people. They were nice to their families, they were nice to their friends, they were just going along with what other people around them were doing. And yet that society, under Hitler's guidance, managed to exterminate 6 million Jews. If I think back at the history of the United States, where I now live, people who thought they were perfectly nice people were holding African Americans as slaves. It's actually quite hard for us to diagnose our own spiritual condition. But Jesus, who calls himself the doctor and says he's come for sinful people, not righteous people, he says, as I mentioned earlier, that if we have been angry with someone, we're actually in that same space as the murderer. If we've looked at somebody lustfully, we're actually in that same space as the adulterer. So that if we're letting Jesus diagnose our spiritual condition, we find that we're far worse than we ever realized. But if we let Jesus love us, we'll find we have more love than we ever dreamed.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. Thank you, Rebecca, so much. So as we draw to an end tonight to this event, I really want to take the opportunity just to thank you, every one of you, for coming. Whether you've been here since the very, very beginning or you've only just joined a couple of minutes ago, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us. And as a Christian Union, we would love to continue this conversation and answer any questions that tonight brought up for you, or the questions which we haven't quite had time to get to tonight. So straight after this live stream ends there, why don't you grab a cup of tea if you're like myself or Rebecca, or a cup of coffee if you're more like James, and perhaps a bit of cake as well if you are feeling a little bit peckish. And join us for a Zoom call and the link for that is in the description box below, where we'll be answering and discussing together some more of these questions. And if you don't even have any questions, please feel free, come along. It will be so lovely to have you there. Even if you just want to sit there, listen in, you don't even have to turn your camera on, and it'll be super chill and a really safe environment just to flesh out some more of these questions, just to get a bit more answers, just to discover what this could all possibly mean. And it'd be really great to have you there. So like I said, the link is in the description box for that Zoom call, and it is happening straight after this live stream ends. So as well as the Zoom call, there are a number of other ways we can continue to have this conversation. So why don't you, as I'm talking right now, just in the description box again, there's a link to a Google form. So if you click on that, you'll see some options of other ways you can get involved. And you can also leave some feedback on tonight on how you thought it's been, and what other events you want to hear, what you want to see us talk about, what topics do you want us to cover. So yeah, you can either sign up for some more information on the events that University of Leeds Christian Union are hosting or running. You can join a hall group. Hall groups are little groups of communities, small groups run by people who are living together in the same halls of residence as yourself. And you're so welcome to join in, meet new people, meet friends, whether or not you'd call yourself a Christian. Perhaps after this, you want to see what a local church is like. So members of the Christian Union attend many different churches across our city, and due to current restrictions, a lot of them are running online. So if that's something you want to get involved with, do drop the Leeds University Christian Union a message, and they can put you with someone, send you a link to some churches which you might find interesting just to have a look into. Perhaps you want to have a deeper conversation on a one-to-one basis with a member of the Christian Union, perhaps over a takeout coffee and a socially distanced walk. Or you can do it over Zoom, whichever is more your vibe. If you want to stay in bed, wrap yourself up in a duvet and have that conversation. If you want to go out into the great outdoors, both are options. So yeah, that's a possibility where you can just talk with someone who is a member of the Christian Union. You can also there's also an option to read the Bible with someone as well. So with someone who's already read it before as well. So there's also the option for that. But yeah, remember the important bit is coming up in a few minutes, and that is the Zoom call where there'll be other people there. It'll be a great time just to answer some more of those questions which you have in a really safe and really comfortable environment. And it'll be so great to see you guys all there. But yeah, that's it from us tonight. I really do hope you've had a great time. I really hope this has been a really fun event for you guys. So tonight was the final event in our Big Question series, and whilst it's sad to see these series come to an end, keep an eye out for all the future events we're going to be hosting. But yes, thank you again for coming tonight. And do get in touch by using the Google form below and joining that Zoom call. But yeah, that's it from us. Bye.